Okay, welcome everyone. This is our class on science and religion, the penultimate class session of our Intro to Philosophy class. Just a couple of reminders. Remember that your final papers and your extra credit papers and any late work like your mind map assignments, those are all due by the end of the day on Thursday. I had originally said the end of class session or the beginning of class session, but really if you get everything to me by the end of the day on Thursday, that'll be fine. But after that, I'm going to draw a hard line and I just won't be taking anything else into account. So make sure you get everything to me by Thursday. So let's dive in and talk about science and religion. This is a topic that has always been a little special to me. Like many of you, I was raised religious and many of you were raised religious, but I'm also a child of the 20th and now 21st century. You know, we live in this post-enlightenment era with all of the progresses of the modern sciences, you know, physics and biology and chemistry and astronomy. You know, we understand so much more about the natural world than definitely than people did 2,000 years ago, but even more than we did 50 years ago. Hell, people understand more now than they did when I was in high school. The progresses of the natural science are amazing. You know, its achievements, whether technological or in terms of just understanding what the universe is made of. And I really want you guys to understand how special that is. You know, no other creature on the planet seems to have the ability to comprehend its place in the cosmos like we do. It's a very unique, special ability. Even the higher primates and other intelligent creatures like dolphins arguably don't have the same kind of understanding we do of what kinds of creatures they are, what the universe is made of, the overall cosmic history of the universe, and how the universe functions, our ability to discern natural laws from the universe around us, mathematically or otherwise. It's a truly remarkable ability that we have. And yet, if you have a religious worldview, I think you'll realize right off the bat that there are these tensions in the relationship between science and religion. But unfortunately, here, I guess I'll advance slides here. And before I forget, because I will if I don't do this, let's get the attendance question out of the way. So the attendance question for the day is, how is it possible for God, if there is such a thing, if you're not religious, imagine that there is, how would it be possible for God to interact with creation if the universe operates according to its own natural laws? So go ahead and put your response to that in the discussion, the relevant discussion forum in Blackboard. By the end of the day, please. So unfortunately, I think the discussion between science and religion is often characterized, and I think that the public discussion often centers on the tension between creation and evolution, or creationism and evolution theory. And obviously that is a good locus of tension between science and religion, right? If you believe the universe was created and that mankind was a created being, that's not going to add up. We are not going to mesh well with the view that the natural universe was a created universe and human beings are a created being made in the image of God, right? Those couched in those terms, science and religion, obviously contradict each other. And unfortunately, I think that's where the modern discussion of science and religion gets stuck. It gets focused on creationism and evolution. And either isn't aware or wants to ignore, or maybe we just like these simplistic tensions between polar opposites. But there's a lot of really constructive, interesting work that's been done in the last 20 or 30 years to reconcile a theological worldview with a naturalistic scientific worldview. And I want you to think of this in terms of coherence theory. Wait, obviously, if you have, you know, two polar opposite worldviews, you know, this really strong religious worldview of a created universe, created human beings, versus a naturalistic worldview that was, you know, sprung into existence randomly from the Big Bang, and then all of the evolutionary history that follows, including biological and human evolution. Those couched in those terms, those two worldviews are going to contradict each other. But I think realistically, most of us have a more complex worldview than that. Scientists themselves probably have a more complex worldview than that. And most religious people already probably hold a more complex worldview than that. Most religious people, especially nowadays, are happy to live in our technological society, understanding all the things about the natural world that we understand, making use of all the technology and technological devices, like keep using my iPhone because it's right here, like our iPhones, like these computers that we're using to have these online classes, like our automobiles. We have a very technological society that relies on so much of science and the knowledge of the natural world that science has given us. Maybe not cosmologically, but at least technologically. And I think, a lot of religious people themselves kind of waffle on the question of evolution. Like some people are really like theological literalists, biblical literalists. They think the universe is only 6,000 years old, or and mankind was literally created, just a few thousand years ago. But a lot of religious people kind of waffle even on that, right? They'll sort of say, well, maybe God is responsible for evolution in some way. Kind of recognizing that maybe this 6,000 year creation story is more metaphorical. And, religious believers themselves in the Christian tradition are all over the place in what they take literally and what they take metaphorically. How willing they are to deviate from the literal about which aspects of their creation story. So that already I want to emphasize that this overly simplistic tension between evolution and creation, which is the popular story of the relationship between science and religion, is really overly simplistic and doesn't take into account the actual beliefs or the actual worldview or the complexities or the inherent tensions of either of those worldviews. A great many scientists have some sort of religious, almost theological reverence for the things they're studying, especially in biology, right? If you're an evolutionary biologist, it's very easy to imbue some sort of religious awe, imbue the things you're studying with some sort of religious awe. And if you're religious, it's over easy to say, oh yeah, I have this religious worldview while making full use of all the technological advances of science. So already, even in this popular discussion, it's massively too simplistic. But I'm interested in moving beyond this creationism and evolution debate. Partly because I think this is what it means to have a coherent worldview. I mean, the goal should not just be to put religion in its own domain and science in its own domain. I mean, that's one way to go, right? I mean, you probably know people who do this. They'll say things like, oh, well, religion tells us why, gives us meaning, tells us about the meaning of life, gives us ethical principles, while over here in a totally separate domain, science tells us about how the natural world works scientifically, how the cosmos functions, laws of nature. And really, those are two separate domains couched in those terms. From my point of view, I think that doesn't do justice to what we want out of a coherent worldview, because religion does make claims about the origin of creation, about the origin of humankind, about how God as a divine being interacts with creation, right? Either in creation event or in the Christ event if you're Christian, in miracles or in answering prayers. These are strong claims about how a divine being interacts with creation. And if those are not just merely metaphorical, if there's something substantive and literal to those belief claims, then you have this problem of how to reconcile that with how the natural world functions. And there's a lot of really interesting work that's going on in those areas. And again, if you're not interested in theology, if you're not religious, maybe not religious anymore, then it's going to be hard to kind of motivate this topic and get you to take this topic interestingly or seriously, right? But if you do have a religious view, or even if you've had a religious worldview in the past, and you've had some sense of the tension between holding all of these claims that religion has about the natural world and about God's relation to mankind and how God interacts with creation, versus how the world seems to function according to natural laws, according to the natural sciences. If you want to hold both of those simultaneously, then the real intellectual work is to build a harmonious worldview that allows both domains to be unified into a coherent whole. And of course, if you're a biblical literalist, you're going to go, well, no, that's not going to be possible. And if you're, what I would call a naive scientist, a scientist who it comes to the scientific table having assumptions like materialism and reductionism and mechanism in place, and that's your view about how the natural world is. And I think a lot of scientists come to the table with that, thinking uncritically about those assumptions. Then of course those aren't going to reconcile with a religious view. But I think if you have a broader sense of what counts as religion, a non-literalist interpretation of religion, but still making some literal claims about God being a real being and, a humankind being some sort of a created being, that God interacts with creation in some way, in all these ways that I just mentioned. If that's not merely metaphorical, and you'll want to hold on to some literal sense of those, but in a broader sense than this naive biblical literalism, then you're going to be open to talking about how God works through laws of nature and some sort of constructive dialogue between, a scientific worldview and your slightly broader religious worldview. And likewise, if you're a scientist, but you're not committed to some of these, what I would call naive scientific assumptions, things like reductionism versus emergence, things like materialism and physicalism, thinking that the only things that exist are physical materialist entities. Things like mechanistic explanations versus top-down explanations, the kinds of things we looked at when we were talking about emergence theory. So if you have a slightly broader view of what counts as scientific, then you're going to be more open to the constructive dialogue between this slightly broader scientific worldview and a slightly broader religious worldview, with the goal in mind of trying to tell a harmonious story from a coherence theory standpoint about how these two worldviews can be reconciled with each other into a coherent whole. And of course, but if you come to the table with these strong literalist assumptions, naive scientific, sort of naive scientific worldview and a naive religious worldview, then of course they're going to be polar opposites and you'll never be able to reconcile them. But I think there's a lot of interesting constructive work that's been done in the last 20 or 30 years to try to reconcile these worldviews. And again, that's only going to be interesting to people who are open to the possibility that there's a way of reconciling these two worldviews. If you view them as polar opposites from the very beginning, then this is going to be a project that is not interesting or not even possible to you. One of the areas that this constructive work focuses on is the problem of divine action. And the problem is basically this. It's basically the problem of the attendance question. How can you account for God's action in a world, universe really, that seems to be governed by its own natural laws, right? This is a fundamental problem if you have a theological worldview and if you hold that the world seems to function according to natural laws, right? Obviously, we have laws of causation, laws of emergence, perhaps, laws of, we do have these mechanistic laws, kind of Newton's laws. We understand a lot, at the quantum level, and we understand a lot at the cosmic level because of general relativity. These are amazing, step leaps of progress in our understanding of the natural world. Given all of that, that the universe seems to function at this naturalistic level, what room is there for a divine being like God to interact with the natural world, again, without violating his own laws of nature? And I think this is the fundamental problem. You could just view God as being capricious, right? God sits outside the universe in some way from a as the creator of the universe, and kind of capriciously intervenes in the operations of the natural world, breaking the laws of nature to do things like miracles. I think a simple example might be, the parting of the Red Sea, right? According to laws of nature, water is moving along in the Red Sea. Maybe it's not really moving, I guess. And God capriciously intervenes and parts the Red Sea, right, through Moses in some way. That is a sort of capricious view of God's action in the world. Right? God set up the laws of nature, let the natural world, all of creation, run according to natural laws, and then intervenes, not maliciously but capriciously, breaking the laws of nature for the sake of these kinds of miracles. Raising people from the dead, that kind of thing. Violating the laws of nature that seem to operate just fine on their own. And I think you can see the fundamental problem with this, right? If God created a world that operates according to natural laws and saw that creation was good in some way, and then intervenes to break those natural laws, there's something incoherent about God's relation to the natural world if God's action in the world is always capricious, is always a matter of breaking the natural laws. So a slightly deeper question would be, how can you reject this notion that God intervenes with the world capriciously, but instead operates through laws of nature rather than violating laws of nature? And you might on the surface say, well, how can that even be possible? If the natural world is functioning according to its own laws, how on earth could God operate through those when those laws of nature seem to function just fine on their own? And I think this is the fundamental problem of of what's called the problem of divine action, right? If you really think that the universe operates just fine on its own at a physical materialist level, including our bodies, including our brains, including everything in the natural world, biological or physical or chemical, then what room is there for God to interact with creation? What does it even mean for God to interact through the natural laws when those natural laws seem to function okay on their own? So this includes things like miracles. If you believe miracles are real, how can you give an account of miracles that's harmonious with natural laws? Revelation, God revealing certain truths to people, either, voice from the sky or a, sense of the, if you believe in the Holy Spirit, then it'd be some sort of, truth revealed in you through the Holy Spirit. It could be sort of theological truths like maybe you see in the book of Acts in the New Testament. If you believe in some sort of divine revelation, again, how can you give an account of that that's harmonious with natural laws rather than a violation of natural laws? Same thing with prayer, some sort of direct communion with the divine. And of course, if you're a Christian believer, one of the key things you're going to believe in is the Christ event, the incarnation of God in the natural world, that God becoming incarnate in the natural world. So you'd also need to give a harmonious account of that. And I think you can see this is a big problem, right? If you want to believe that the universe operates on its own according to natural laws, but you also want to hold on to these theological concepts and have a broadly religious view, then there's a lot of intellectual and scientific work to be done to try to reconcile these two seemingly opposite worldviews. And again, you can always take the easy path, which is to say they're just separate domains and they're incompatible. Either you have to go have a radically religious worldview at the expense of science, or you have to have a radically scientific view at the expense of religion. Or you have to try to put them in separate domains, like science tells us how the universe works, and the religious worldview, religion tells us what it means and gives us some ethical principles to live by, but maybe doesn't take things literally. I think all of those are unsatisfactory. If you really genuinely have a religious worldview, you're going to believe in some subset of these things. You're going to believe in miracles. You're going to believe in prayer. You're going to believe in revelation. And most importantly, if you're a Christian, except one of the really radically liberal varieties of Christianity that writes off Christ as not being divine at all, if you believe in some sort of divinity of Jesus, then you're going to hold on to some of these principles as literal, right? These aren't just metaphorical if you're genuinely a religious believer. So it's not enough just to put them in separate domains. They're really, if you want to hold on to a religious worldview and a scientific worldview, they need to be reconciled in some way. Otherwise, you're just going to have a bifurcated worldview that's incoherent, that doesn't cohere, that has principles you believe or items you believe that don't make sense. Again, thinking of it in terms of a web of belief, like we talked about when we were talking about coherence theory. So this should be the goal. How do you give an account of God's action in the world that's not capricious, that doesn't amount to violating his own laws of nature? That is, I think, the fundamental starting point for modern discussions of the problem of divine action. I want to return to this problem of causal exclusion that we talked about when we were talking about philosophy of mind, because I think just like the discussion of free will, how is it possible for our minds to exert some sort of causal influence on the natural world, and that's a problem in itself, but it's also a problem for our action in the world as free agents, right? If there's no room for our mind to interact causally with the natural world, you can plausibly say, well, any intentionality, any decisions we make, any causation that stems from our minds is merely an illusion because the natural world seems to function just fine on its own. And again, just as a refresher here, P1 and P2 in this diagram are physical events. Like P1 might be a physical brain state at one point in time, and P2 might be a physical brain state at a subsequent point in time. M1 would be like a mental property, an intention or a decision, a desire, that kind of thing. And then the question is, well, if P2 has a sufficient previous physical cause, a previous brain state, or even something broader in scope than that, some sort of physiological cause. Could be some complex cause arising from our brains and our bodies conjointly, but something purely physical. And that's sufficient to bring about P2, because causation seems to happen just fine on its own. We don't ever seem to need to invoke anything metaphysical or anything beyond the lowest level of physics to account for why P2 happens. It doesn't seem like there's any room left over for the mental property to cause anything. Hence, you might say there is no such thing as mental causation. Hence, there is no such thing as free will. And that's a huge problem in philosophy of mind if you're a non-reductive physicalist. If you think that the mind is still some sort of non-reducible property, then it seems like it's not necessary to account for why anything occurs. You can always tell a lower level physical story at the level of neuroscience or anatomy or physiology that seems to preclude the need to invoke a mental cause at all. So the reason I'm bringing this up yet again is that I think this is directly analogous to the problem of divine action in theology. And the problem is this: take any event in the physical world. If it's possible to give a completely adequate physical explanation of that cause, but you also want to hold on to this notion that God brings about certain events in the world, again, either through miracles or through answering prayers or through incarnation in the Christ event, or through revelation and some sort of communion with our minds in some way, then you've got a real problem, right? How exactly can God bring about something in the natural world that isn't already caused by something physical in the natural world? So the existence of sufficient causation in the natural world seems to preclude the possibility that God can intervene in the world without being capricious. There's nothing sort of left over for God to do that isn't already accounted for on the level of physical causation. So I think of these two discussions as being largely the same discussion. How can an irreducible, maybe emergent mental property or mental event in the kinds of items of consciousness that we have, intentionality and desire and decisions and all the things that make up our mental life, if there's a problem with how those things interact with the natural world, it's basically the same problem. How can a divine being that seems to have these non-physical properties, it's not like you can point to God in the physical world and say, oh, that's God, so obviously God can interact with the physical world. God in some sense is outside the cosmos with these non-physical properties, just like our mind seems to have non-physical properties, or at least properties that are different than lower level physical properties like brain states. So then the problem is, how can God interact with the natural world when the natural world seems to function just fine on its own according to natural causation, like you see in the diagram here? And I think there are a few possible responses here. One is, again, quantum physics, right? If it turns out that the universe is not deterministic in nature, as 20th century quantum mechanics seems to tell us, maybe that's some wiggle room for God to be the determining factor that can kind of steer causation probabilistically through this non-determinacy that you see in the quantum world. But I think this has its own problems, right? Quantum mechanics, does have laws. They're not deterministic laws. It sure looks like. It looks like they're probabilistic laws. So if it turns out that, 75% of the time the electron is over here and 25% of the time the electron goes that way, I'm not sure why that gives God any more control over the natural world than mere random chance. So it's promising. At least it opens up a little wiggle room in terms of how the future of the universe can unfold. But trying to explain God's action with the natural world in that way, you're going to run up against all the same problems of trying to explain human free will and mental causation in terms of quantum mechanics. It looks like it steers us more towards random chance rather than having more control over how the universe actually unfolds. And if you think God is steering the path of the universe, causing things to happen through the laws of nature, kind of steering the direction of the future, in some sort of in some sort of divine plan, if you want to think really grandiosely about it, then you're going to run into this problem where it doesn't look like that gives God any actual control. It looks like it's just random chance, and that doesn't seem any better from an explanatory standpoint. I think a really promising, interesting way to go is to talk about what is known as the emergence of spirit. Again, if you think about human beings as a kind of emergent being. You can look at human beings completely reductionistically. You can say, okay, yes, our minds are just what's going on in our brains neuroscientifically. And the way our body functions in the natural world is just a matter of how our different body parts function, all the different organs that make us up and how they function together. You can kind of explain away these human qualities reductionistically. Another way to go, though, is to think of it in terms of the things that emerge from the natural world. A couple of class sessions ago, we looked at the cosmic history of the universe, right? From the Big Bang to the inflationary period, to the creation of stars and galaxies, to the nuclear furnace that builds heavy elements, to the formation of life, to the evolution of complex life forms, eventually to the evolution of humans, leading to all of the interesting things that make humans what they are: culture and society and psychology and philosophy, even all the poetry and art, and all the things that make up human life and human culture are in some sense emergent. And if you're open to the notion that at every level of emergence, there's a type of top-down causation that we talked about when we were talking about mental causation and emergence. Causation from that emergent higher level of description to the components that make up those complex systems. Then you have an interesting option here. You can say, well, at a certain point, a being like human beings either naturally evolves or through God's action, in steering evolution, maybe through quantum physics, maybe through some other mechanism. Again, this is all very, very kind of abstract and theoretical, right? This is the work for real scientists and real theologians to do, right? But if God can somehow interact with the natural world through the natural laws, directing the evolution of the biological world to the point where a being like us evolves, a being with these divine attributes. If you have a religious worldview, you're going to think humans are quote unquote made in God's image in some sense. We have attributes like free will. We have a spiritual life. We have the ability to, we have a moral sense, right? These things, if you view the evolution of humans from the perspective of emergence, these are emergent qualities, right? At a certain point, perhaps spirit, what we would call a spirit, maybe not a soul in some sort of dualistic sense, but a spiritual life, having a spiritual sense, having some sense of a divine presence in you, I guess I'm trying to think how to put this, but it would amount to, a being like us having a spiritual life emerging out of the natural world, through evolution, through the natural laws, but then being able to commune with the divine being at this higher level of description. Again, I've used the example of a snowflake, right? So a snowflake, as it evolves, it's being sort of steered and directed by its environment, but you can only explain that at the level of the environment. So if you view human spirituality as an emergent property as a higher level of description, and you view spiritual interactions either with each other in worship or with the divine being in revelation, in God's, in God answering your prayers, this is at a higher level of description than what's going on at the lower level, physical components that make up our bodies, right? But I guess my point is that if the environment can exert a top-down causal influence on the formation of the snowflake, then it seems by analogy that our interaction with God or with each other spiritually can exert some sort of top-down causal influence on the natural world through that higher level of description. And in theology, this is called the emergence of spirit. But I think in order to make sense of divine action, you have to pair that concept up with some sort of top-down causation, that through those interactions at a higher level of description, you get some sort of causal influence from the divine through that higher level of description. In other words, the spirit that's emerged out of the natural world because of the kinds of beings we are on the natural world, on our bodies, and in the rest of the natural world by extension. It's a very promising, interesting notion, but it hinges on this notion of emergence, right? And the notion of top-down causation collectively. And if you're a reductionist, you're not going to buy any of that, right? You're going to say, oh, no, all causation is just what's happening, based on our atoms and molecules and, this sort of lower level physical description of what's going on in our bodies or in our brains neurophysiologically. But if you're open to the notion that at every level of emergence in the history of the cosmos, there are genuinely emergent entities and genuinely emergent properties. And through these higher level interactions, there's a causal influence on the lower level components that make up those systems. Now you've got a little bit of wiggle room for there to be some kind of divine action without violating the natural laws. And I think what's interesting is that, again, kind of, I don't want to dwell on the snowflake example too much, but I think it's a fruitful example. As the snowflake forms, you could arguably say there's a causal influence on the environment to the snowflake, right? The snowflake is being formed or shaped by its environment in some sense. But all of that is happening without violating any natural laws, right? There's nothing mystical, nothing magical, nothing capricious about that, right? The causal interactions between the atoms and molecules within the snowflake are working just fine according to natural laws, right? There's no laws of nature being violated when the environment is forming a snowflake. It's very naturalistic. So again, by extension, if the human person or the human spirit is an emergent property and there's some sort of interaction at the spiritual interaction at this higher level of description that exerts some sort of causal influence on our minds and brains and bodies and the natural world as a whole, all of that might be able to happen without violating the laws of nature at the microscopic level. And that's a really fascinating idea. It's a completely different way of viewing causation that's still harmonious with everything that physics and chemistry and biology tells us about how the natural world functions. But it hinges on these notions of emergence and top-down causation, which you're either going to reject outright if you're a reductionist, or you're going to be open to if you're more of a systems biologist that's open to the emergence of complex systems and all the novel properties that they have. Of course, cosmology is still a problem, right? The universe did come into existence somehow. So I think we still tend, if you're religious, you still tend to reach for these arguments that have been given in the history of philosophy to prove God's existence, like the cosmological argument from Thomas Aquinas. I think the Big Bang Theory, for example, has given us a new way of talking about the origin of the cosmos that could be harmonious with the divine being, right? If you really think there's a problem with the universe springing into existence literally from nothing, like Big Bang theorists would say, if you ask them what happened before the Big Bang, they go, bad question, because there was no time before the Big Bang. But you could say, wait a minute, something can't spring from nothing. If there was literally nothing, how can there be a universe that springs into existence from literally nothing? You might think that a religious worldview gives a better explanation for the creation of the universe as a whole than this purely naturalistic Big Bang Theory view, which again, not rejecting the Big Bang, like still accepting that the Big Bang occurred, accepting everything physicists and cosmologists would have to say about how the universe unfolded. But if you focus on its origin, like why did it happen in the first place, you might say, well, a religious worldview provides a better answer to that question than a reductionistic, purely naturalistic, mechanistic worldview. And of course, I think the possibility of divinely directed evolution is a fascinating one. If there's a way to account for a God as a divine being steering the course of evolution, but not capriciously, not violating the laws of nature, working through the laws of nature to ensure that a being like human beings ends up in existence, a being with free will, a being with a spiritual life, a being with a moral sense, a being, in other words, that has these divine properties that we associate with being, quote unquote, made in God's image. If all of that can happen through the laws of nature without God being capricious and breaking his own laws of nature, that's a really promising approach as well. Again, I think that would have to do with some sort of emergence and some sort of top-down causation. Every time a new species evolves, there's a kind of emergent property there, right? That creature has different properties and different ways of being. Maybe a different, if those beings are conscious, maybe they have their own kind of mental conscious life. If all of those are emergent properties, the way causation would operate would be through top-down causation. Again, top-down causal influences without violating the bottom-up laws of nature. And that's a fascinating way to reconcile a purely naturalistic approach to evolution that seems to operate fine on its own, but allowing God to steer it through the laws of nature rather than violating the laws of nature. And again, if you think that's bunk, and if you're a reductionist, if you have this kind of naive scientific worldview, if you think all explanations are reductionistic and you don't buy the emergence of qualitatively different phenomena, if you just think of it in terms of complex systems, in other words, then you're not going to be open to this possibility at all. But if you see that with every level of emergence, there are qualitatively new and novel properties, and if you're open to the idea of top-down causal influences, in other words, if it turns out the natural world really does work that way, which is an open question, even in physics, even in chemistry, even in biology, then you're going to be more open to this kind of interaction with the divine through top-down causation, steering the course of the natural world, either cosmologically or in its evolutionary history. But again, most importantly, without violating the laws of nature. Otherwise, you end up with God as this capricious, magical being who just, willy-nilly interacts with the world and violates laws of nature. And I think you can see that that's something a little dissatisfying about that view. It doesn't seem coherent. So I think these are some of the options. One way of talking about this sort of culturally is that with the modern scientific worldview, there was a disenchantment of the natural world. Think about what your view of the natural world would have been like prior to modern science. There were spirits, maybe ghosts, had sort of these what's the right word? Paranormal? Is that the right word? Supernatural. That's the word I was looking for. It had these kind of supernatural qualities, right? It wasn't just a purely mechanistic world. People didn't view the world as billiard balls bouncing around on the table. It was alive in some sense. There were spirits and there was a metaphysical quality to it. Things were enchanted, in other words. They were magical. And you saw that everywhere. If you have a radically religious worldview, you see the influence of the divine everywhere. But along with the natural sciences comes a disenchantment of the natural world, which is, I think, interesting. It's a huge cultural break with the vast majority of human history, right? For thousands and thousands and thousands of years, humans had a mythical / mystical / supernatural enchanted view of the world, right? And then along comes contemporary science from Newton and Galileo and Copernicus onward. Maybe you can find the seeds in Aristotle. But I think disenchantment is a good word, like the enchanted qualities of the world, the things that made it mystical and magical and supernatural were kind of stripped out of our view of the natural world, the world around us. And this involved things like reductionism, explanations that only function at the lowest level, like kind of explaining away these emergent properties in terms of the lower level components that make them up. Materialism and physicalism, thinking that only physical things exist, that anything non-physical is just kind of, mystical mumbo jumbo that doesn't exist. Mechanistic explanations, trying to explain everything in terms of mechanisms. I think even the steady state theory versus the Big Bang theory kind of took this away, right? On the one hand, if the universe is static, if it doesn't expand, if there was no Big Bang, if it always existed, that what was known as the steady state theory in physics, there's no room for God in that view, right? If the universe just always existed, right? It's a purely sort of naturalistic view, the cosmos having no origin. And then the Big Bang theory, might have been a little more harmonious with the notion of a creator because the universe at least had an origin. But cosmologists gave this completely naturalistic evolutionary history of the cosmos, and again, kind of squeezing God out of the picture, right? So all of modern cosmology seems to lead towards this disenchanted worldview as well. Obviously, the theory of evolution, right? If biological evolution is naturalistic, if there's no divine influence on the evolution of species or of human beings, again, that's a reason to disenchant the worldview. All of the seemingly magical things, life forms and human beings and all the properties that we have, spiritual or otherwise, if you can account for all those things naturalistically, again, that's kind of squeezes the enchanted qualities out of our picture of the natural world. Of course, this dovetails right into the origins of humanity and human evolution, right? If all of our human properties can be explained naturalistically, again, there's no need to invoke anything divine, and that tends to disenchant our view of the world. And all of astronomy and cosmology, I think that should be kind of obvious, seeing how the universe functions as a whole, either cosmologically or in the things we notice about the astronomical functionings of the universe, planets orbiting stars and nuclear fusion inside stars, all the naturalistic things that astronomers and cosmologists have learned about how the natural world functions, that tends to squeeze God out of the picture as well. So how do you recapture this sense of an enchanted worldview without reverting to a pre-scientific worldview? And I think this is the interesting question. If you find the disenchanted worldview problematic. And if you're religious, you should, right? Because if you hold that there's something supernatural or something divine or something mystical or metaphysical in any sense, the disenchantment of the worldview through modern science should bother you because it doesn't match up with the things you believe. So the question should be, I think, how can you recapture the enchantment, reverse the disenchantment of the natural world without reverting to a pre-scientific worldview? Because reverting to a pre-scientific worldview would be rejecting all the things that this is stuff we ostensibly know, right? We know a lot about how the universe works at a fundamental microscopic subatomic level. We know a lot in terms of day-to-day Newtonian physics about how things move about in the world. We understand a lot neurophysiologically. We understand a lot astronomically and cosmologically. And I think reverting to a pre-scientific worldview would undermine all of these things that we have learned through science, right? I don't think any of us wants to reject the things that science has given us. So the question is, how do you hold on to this enchanted worldview, either narrowly in the Judeo-Christian sense or broadly in some sort of mystical spiritual sense, while holding on to all the things that science has told us about how the natural world actually works, ostensibly because it's right before our very eyes? And I think there are a few things that go along with this. I think there's some changes in the way that in our view about how science functions. I think nowadays, even scientists themselves are open to the notion that science is not value free. Science has its own ethics and its own principles and its own non-scientific values that inform how science actually functions. It's not as neutral and value-free as was commonly held in the 20th century, even throughout the entire modern period. It's kind of a postmodern view of science, that science has its own values and its own virtues that science itself doesn't prove. The kind of issues that Jean-Francois Lyotard was talking about in the postmodern condition. Science tells this story about itself, but doesn't try to justify that story scientifically. So if you're open to this postmodern view of science, that science itself is not value-free, you're not going to have this kind of naive scientific view that science is the only objective window into reality that we've got, in the sense of being value-free. Of course, we commonly have this story of the origin of modern science that isn't accurate at all. We talk about the strong contrast between, say, the Catholic Church and figures like Galileo, being in opposition to each other, and Galileo, being put under house arrest, that kind of thing. But really, that doesn't do justice to this constructive dialogue that's happened in the history of religion and the history of science, the constructive partnership that has almost always existed there. The Catholic Church were the ones who built observatories and funded research, until figures like Galileo started conflicting a bit too much. And of course, scientists themselves thought that they were revealing something about the divine in discovering things about the natural world. And I think modern biologists, who are religious, sometimes talk about it this way, and cosmologists sometimes talk about it this way. Einstein basically thought this was like understanding the cosmos was like revealing the mind of God in some sense. So scientists themselves are not as opposed to religion as they're commonly characterized to be, at least some of them. And in the history of religion has had an ongoing constructive dialogue with the natural sciences, funding it in a lot of cases. You can see Descartes was doing both. He was concerned with religion and God's nature, and he was concerned with how the natural world functions. And in the course of the evolution of our modern scientific worldview and the modern period in general in philosophy, there's a lot more constructive dialogue and an attempt to reconcile these seemingly opposing domains of human experience than is given credit for in the popular discussion of science and religion. I think that's a shame because it doesn't do justice to how science actually emerged and its ongoing relationship with religion and vice versa. Of course, recent developments in science, right? We talked about quantum mechanics. I've mentioned systems biology a few times, top-down causation related to both of those. And of course, these are things that, as new scientific principles emerge, new ways of looking about how the natural world functions. And again, I think we have to avoid stepping back in time, right? It's too easy to look at the natural world through the lens of Newton or through the lens of Galileo or through the lens of Copernicus, ignoring all the things we've learned since then. The quantum world doesn't function that way. And cosmologically, the universe doesn't seem to function that way. The biological world doesn't seem to function like Newton thought it did. It involves things like emergent properties, and it involves systems treated as a whole, and it involves things like top-down causation, and it involves things like indeterminacy with quantum mechanics. And that's how the natural world functions. It does not function deterministically like Newton thought it did. And unfortunately, when people in the popular discussion debate science versus religion, they almost revert to this kind of pre-contemporary scientific, almost, Newtonian view, just billiard balls bonking around on the table. So of course there's no room for God to interact with creation. But, if you take this very modern, very contemporary view about how the natural world functions, there's a lot more wiggle room to talk about how that's harmonious with religion than the world that Newton saw when he saw basically billiard balls bonking around on a table or an apple falling on his head. Of course, complex relationship between mind and matter, the emergence of mind, and maybe some sort of top-down causal influence from the mind onto your brain or onto your body. And of course, all of this discussion seems to hinge on the coherence theory of truth. Not trying to prove religion objectively, not trying to view science as the one objective, sort of neutral third-person point of view window into creation or into reality, but viewing each of these as a worldview with its own assumptions and its own beliefs and its own things that it has learned and types of experiences that each of those domains seems to capture, but trying to reconcile and build a harmonious worldview out of those. If you're not open to truth as coherence versus truth as, say, foundationalism with Descartes, where each worldview needs to rest on these first principles that are absolutely certain and able to be proven objectively. If that's not your view of truth, if truth is a matter of building a coherent worldview, reconciling the anomalies where your worldview doesn't match up or isn't harmonious, then you're going to be much more open to this constructive dialogue between science and religion. I want to look at the reading now for today. This is something I encountered way back when I was an undergraduate. It's quite old, but I still find it quite inspiring. I'm going to stop sharing this slide presentation and shift gears and look at the reading now. You don't get story time with me too much, but I'm going to do a little bit of story time. I'm going to read some of this because I think this is really inspiring. I hope I can get through all of this in the next 25 minutes or so. But I want you to really kind of immerse yourself in this. And I want to give a little background. Like I want you to be kind of open to your worldview as a whole and trying to reconcile the things that don't match up. If you're bothered by the reductionistic, mechanistic explanations of and view of the natural world that seems to squeeze out the things that are uniquely human, or seems to squeeze out the divine, or squeeze out the spiritual, if part of your view is to try to retain those qualities, the things that make us uniquely human and the things that give us this rich spiritual life, if you believe that's a real thing, then what kind of stories do we tell? How do we reconcile these? And this piece by Brian Swimme is fascinating because he basically says that what's happened in the modern time period is we've lost our ability to tell a cosmic story about ourselves. We focused on so much on the human sphere, and our narrow little universe here on Earth, that we've forgotten about the cosmic story and what kind of spiritual qualities and maybe ethical qualities that might have for us in telling the story in grander terms than it's commonly told. Yes, we can talk about, yes, there's a Big Bang theory, and then everything in between up till the human sphere is kind of like, and then, 14 billion years of stuff happens. And then finally the interesting things happen here on Earth, and, life evolves and eventually humans evolve. And that's the interesting stuff. That's the story as it's commonly told. But he's saying, if we tell the cosmic story about our ties to the origin of the cosmos and everything in between, we can kind of re-enchant our view and a view of ourselves and our view of the natural world and our place in the natural world through narrative in this sort of postmodern sense. I find that really fascinating. So I'm just going to read some of this. I hope you'll indulge me and find this interesting. I hope my voice is palatable as I just read to you. But I think this is even worse today. He starts out by saying, our planetary difficulties, our technologies have resulted in 50,000 nuclear warheads. Our industrial economies have given us ecocide on every continent. Our social distribution of goods and services has given us 1 billion underdeveloped and starving humans. One thing we can conclude without argument: as a species and as a planet, we are in terrible shape. And this is probably even worse now. So as we consider proposals for leading us out of this dying world, we need to bear in mind that only proposals promising an immense efficacy need be considered. Anything less than a fundamental transformation of our situation is hardly worth talking about. And yet, given this demand, my own suggestion is that we tell stories. In particular, that we tell the many stories that comprise the great cosmic story. I'm suggesting that this activity of cosmic storytelling is the central political and economic act of our time. My basic claim is that by telling our cosmic creation story, we can inaugurate a new era of human and planetary health. For we initiate a transformation out of a world that is, to use David Griffin's thorough formulation, mechanistic, scientistic, dualistic, patriarchal, Eurocentric, anthropocentric, militaristic, and reductionistic. None of those having, very good connotations. A cosmic creation story is that which satisfies the questions asked by humans fresh out of the womb. As soon as they get here and learn the language, children ask the cosmic questions. Where did everything come from? What is going on? Why are you doing such and such anyway? The young of our species desire to learn where they are and what they are about in this life. That is, they express an inherent desire to hear their cosmic story. By cosmic creation story, I also mean to indicate those accounts of the universe we told each other around the evening fires for most of the last 50,000 years. These cosmic stories were the way the first humans chose to initiate and install their young into the universe. The rituals, the traditions, the taboos, the ethics, the techniques, the customs, and all the values all had as their core a cosmic story. The story provided the central cohesion for each society. Story, in this sense, is, quote, world interpretation, a likely account of the development and nature and value of things in this world. Why story? Why should story be fundamental? Because without storytelling, we lose contact with our basic realities in this world. We lose contact because only through story can we fully recognize our existence in time. To be human is to be in a story. To forget one's story is to go insane. All the tribal peoples show an awareness of the connection between health and storytelling. The original humans will have their cosmic stories just as surely as they will have their food and drink. Our ancestors recognized that the universe, at its most basic level, is story. Each creature is story. Humans enter this world and awaken to a simple truth. We must find our story within this great epic of being. What about our situation today? Do we tell stories? We most certainly do, even if we don't call them stories. In our century's textbooks, because this is the last century, but this continues right up into the 21st century, for use in grade schools and high schools, we learn that it all began with impoverished primitives marched through the technological inventions of the scientific period and culminated, this is usually only implied, but there's never any much doubt, in the United States of America and its political freedom and, most of all, in its superior modes of production. For proof, graphs of industrial output compare the United States with other countries. Throughout our educational experiences, we were drawn into an emotional bonding with our society, so that it was only natural that we would want to support, defend, and extend our society's values and accomplishments. Of course, this was not considered story. We were learning the facts. I think you probably put facts and irony quotes there. Obviously, Soviets, because again, this was written during the Cold War, Soviets reflecting on their educational process recall a different story, one that began with the same denigration of the primal peoples, continued through a critique of bourgeois society, and culminated in the USSR. And the French or British reflecting on their educations remember learning that, in fact, they were the important societies, for they were extending the European cultural tradition, while avoiding both the superficiality of the Americans and the lugubriousness of the Soviets. Although we told ourselves such human stories, none of us in the industrial countries taught our children cosmic stories. We focused entirely on the human world when telling our stories of value and meaning. The universe and Earth taken together were merely backdrop. The oceans were large, the species many, yes, but these immensities were just the stage for the humans. This mistake is the fundamental mistake of our era. In a sentence, I summarize my position this way. All our disasters today are directly related to our having been raised in cultures that ignored the cosmos for an exclusive focus on the human. Our uses of land, our uses of technology, our uses of each other are flawed in many ways, but due fundamentally to the same folly. We fail in so grotesque a manner because we were never initiated into the realities and values of the universe. Without the benefit of a cosmic story that provided meaning to our existence as Earthlings, we were stranded in an abstract world and left to invent nuclear weapons and chemical biocides and ruinous exploitations and waste. How could this have happened? How could modern Western culture escape a 50,000-year-old tradition of telling cosmic stories? We discovered science. So impressed were we with this blinding light, we simply threw out the cosmic stories for the knowledge that the sciences provided. Why tell the story of the sun as a god when we knew the sun was the locus of thermonuclear reactions? We pursued scientific law, relegating, quote, story and, quote, myth to the nurseries and tribes. Science gave us the real, and the best science was mathematical science. We traded myth for mathematics, and without realizing it, we entered upon an intellectual quest that had for its goal a complete escape from the shifting sands of the temporal world. I'm so bad with pronouncing these names. As Ilya Prigogine summarizes, for most of the founders of classical science, even for Einstein, science was an attempt to go beyond the world of appearances, to reach a timeless world of supreme rationality. In other words, the world of Spinoza, who is a rationalistic philosopher we didn't cover in this semester. What a shock that it had to have been, what a shock it has to have been to have story reappear. And this time right in the very center of the mathematical sciences. Someday someone will tell the full story of how story forced its way into the most anti-story domain of modern science. I mean mathematical physics. Here I would like to indicate in broad strokes what has happened. For physicists during the modern period, reality meant the fundamental interactions of the universe. In a sense, the world's physical essence was considered captured by the right group of mathematical equations. Gravity and the strong nuclear interaction were the real actors in the universe. This actual course of events was seen as of secondary importance, as the details structured by the fundamental dynamics of physical reality. The story of time was regarded as secondary, even illusory. Time was simply a parameter that appeared in the equations. That is, nothing was special about the time today as opposed to some time 1 billion years from now. Each time was the same, for the mathematical equation showed no difference between any two times. The best story I know concerning this dismissal of time concerns Albert Einstein. Out of his own amazing genius, he arrived at his famous field equations, the mathematical laws governing the universe in its physical macro dimensions. What most alarmed Einstein, and we must remember that here was a man who had the courage to stick to his mathematical insights no matter how shocking they might seem to the world. What most disturbed Einstein about his own equations was their implication that the universe was expanding. Such a notion made no sense in the Newtonian cosmology of a static universe, which held that the universe today is essentially the same as the universe at any other time. In Newton's universe, motion could exist in the universe, but the idea that the universe as a whole was changing was hardly thinkable. For these reasons, Einstein's equations stunned him when they first whispered their secret, that the universe is not static, that the universe is expanding each moment into a previously non-existent space, that the universe is a dynamic, developing reality. To avoid these alarming implications, Einstein altered his equations to eliminate their predictions. If only the truth of the universe could be so easily contained. Soon after Einstein published his equations, the Russian mathematician Alexander Friedmann found solutions to Einstein's equations. These solutions were theoretical universes, some of which expanded, some of which contracted, some of which oscillated in and out. Einstein's response to Friedmann's communication was a polite dismissal of what seemed to be an utterly preposterous mathematical fiction. But when Edwin Hubble later showed that the empirical evidence for an expanding universe, Einstein realized his failure of nerve. He later came to regard his doctoring of the field equation as, quote, the biggest blunder of my life. My point is the complete surprise this discovery was for the scientists involved. If Einstein had left the equations as he had come to them, he would have made the greatest prediction in the history of science. But such a leap out of a static universe into a cosmic story was simply beyond the pale, even for our century's greatest scientist. Even so, we now realize, following the work of Einstein, Hubble, and others, that our universe had a beginning in time, and it has been developing from 15 to 20 billion years. And every moment of this universe is new. That is, we now realize that we live not in a static Newtonian space, we live within an ongoing cosmic story. Story forced its way still further into physics when in recent decades, scientists discovered that even the fundamental interactions of the universe evolved into their present forms. The laws that govern the physical universe today and that were thought to be immutable are themselves the result of developments over time. We'd always assumed that the laws were fixed, absolute, and eternal. We now discover that even the laws tell their own story of the universe. That is the cosmic story. Rather than being simply governed by fixed underlying laws, draws these laws into its drama. Story inserts itself still further into the consciousness of contemporary physicists. I think I see we're going to run out of time. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. I think you have the reading, but I think you can get the idea that there's something grander going on in the evolution of the cosmos than what is typically told in the story of the creation of the cosmos. Yes, if you're religion, you've got this religious view about meaning, but when we tell the modern creation story, the Big Bang Theory story of creation and the evolution of the cosmos, we lose these narrative elements that give our place in the universe meaning. And you can read a bit about that in the middle of this article here. So let me skip ahead. Here we go. He says, we must encourage cosmic storytellers because our dominant culture is blind to their value. Is it not remarkable that we can obtain several hundred books on how to get a divorce, how to invest money, how to lose fat, all the things you find in the most modern bookstores. And yet there is nothing available to assist those destined to sing to us the great epic of reality. I suggest that when the artists of the cosmic story arrive, our mono-industrial assault and suicide will end and the new beginnings of the earth will be at hand. Our situation is similar to that of the early Christians. They had nothing but a profound revelatory experience. They did nothing but wander about telling a new story. And yet the Western world entered into a transformation from which it has never recovered. So too with our moment. We have nothing compared to the massive accumulation of hate, fear, and arrogance that the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the third world debt, and the chemical toxins represent. But we are in the midst of a revelatory experience of the universe that must be compared in its magnitude with those of the great religious revelations. And we need only wander about telling this new story to ignite a transformation of humanity. For this story has the power to undo the mighty and arrogant and to ignite the creativity of the oppressed and forgotten. As the great journey of the universe breaks into human self-awareness, nothing can dam up our desire to shake off the suffocation of nationalism, anthropocentrism, and exploitation, and to plunge instead into the adventure of the cosmos. Let me end with an imaginary event, a moment in the future when children are taught by a cosmic storyteller. We can imagine a small group gathered around a fire in a hillside meadow, or maybe in an online class like this one. The woman in the middle is the oldest, a grandmother to some of the children present. If we can today already imagine such an event, we can be assured that tomorrow someone will begin the journey of bringing such dreams into practice. The old woman might begin by picking up a chunk of granite. At one time, at the beginning of the earth, the whole planet was a boiling sea of molten rock. We revere rocks because everything has come from them, not just the continents and the mountains, but the trees, the oceans, and your bodies. The rocks are your grandmother and your grandfather. When you remember all those who have helped you in this life, you begin with the rocks, for if it not for them, you would not be. She holds the rock before them in silence, showing each person in turn. Do you hear the rock singing? In the last era, people thought there was no music in rocks, but we know now that is not true. After all, some of the rocks became Mozart and showed their music as Mozart. Or did you think that the earth had to go to Mars to learn how to play its music? No, Mozart is rocks. Mozart is the music of the earth's rocks. Now she slowly sinks her hand into the ground and holds the rich, loamy soil before her. Each rock is a symphony, but the music of the soil soars beyond capture in human language. We had to go into outer space to realize how rare and unique soil is. Only the earth created soil. There's no soil on the moon. There are minerals on the moon, but no soil. There's no soil on Mars. There's no soil on Venus, or on the sun, or on Jupiter, or anywhere else in the surrounding trillion miles. Even the Earth, the most extraordinary creative being of the solar system, required 4 billion years to create topsoil. We worship and nurture and protect the soils of the Earth because all music and all life and all happiness come from the soil. The soils are the matrix of human joy. She points now to a low-hanging star in the great bowl of the night sky. Right now, that star is at work creating the elements that will one day live as sentient beings. All the matter of the Earth was created by the grandmother star that preceded our sun. She fashioned the carbon and nitrogen and all the elements that would later become all the bodies and things of Earth, including all of us. And when she was done with her immense creativity, she exploded in celebration of her achievement, sharing her riches with the universe and enabling our birth. Her destiny is your destiny. In the center of your being, you too will create, and you too will shower the world with your creativity. Your lives will be filled with both suffering and joy. You will often be faced with death and hardship. But all of this finds its meaning in your participation in the great life of Earth. It is because of your creativity that the cosmic journey deepens. She stares into the distance. In the long silence, she hears the thundering breakers on the ocean shore, just visible in the evening's light. They listen as the vast tonnage of salt water is lifted up in silence, then again pounds up the sand. Think of how tired we were when we arrived here, and all we had to do was carry our little bodies up the hills. Now think of the work that is being done ceaselessly as all the oceans of the world curl into breakers against the shores. And think of all the work that is done ceaselessly as the earth is pulled around the sun. Think of all the work that is done ceaselessly as all the 100 billion stars of the Milky Way are pulled around the center of the galaxy. And yet the stars don't think of this as work, nor do the oceans think of their ceaseless tides as work. They are drawn irresistibly into their activities moment after moment. The earth finds itself drawn irresistibly to the sun and would find any other path in life utterly intolerable. What amazing work the stars and planets accomplish, and never do we hear them complain. We humans and we animals are no different at all, for we find ourselves just as irresistibly drawn to follow certain paths in life. And if we pursue these paths, our lives, even if they should become filled with suffering and hardship, are filled as well with a quality of effortlessness. Once we respond to our deepest allurements in the universe, we find ourselves carried away. We find ourselves on the edge of a wave passing through the cosmos that had its beginnings 15 to 20 billion years ago in the fiery explosion of the beginning of time. The great joy of human being is to enter into this allurement which pervades everything and to empower others, including the soil and the grasses and all the forgotten, so that they might enter their own path into their deepest allurement. The light of dusk is gone. She sits with them in the deepening silence of the dark. The fire has died down to become a series of glowing points, mirroring the ocean of starlight all above them. You will be tempted at times to abandon your dreams, to settle for cynicism or greed. So great will your anxieties and fears appear to you. But no matter what happens, remember that our universe is a universe of surprise. We put our confidence not in our human egos, but in the power that gathered the stars and knit the first living cells together. Remember that you are here through the creativity of others. You have awakened in a great epic of being, a drama that is 15 to 20 billion years in the making. The intelligence that ignited the first minds, the care that spaced the notes of the nightingale, the power that heaved all 100 billion galaxies across the sky now awakens as you too and permeates your life no less thoroughly. We do not know what mystery awaits us in the very next moment, but we can be sure we will be astonished and enchanted. This entire universe sprang into existence from a single numinous speck. Our origin is mystery. Our destiny is intimate community with all that is, and all our common species aim is to celebrate the great joy which has drawn us into itself. Rocks, soils, waves, stars, as they tell their story in 10,000 languages throughout the planet, they bind us to them in our emotions, our spirits, our minds, and our bodies. The earth and the universe speak in all this. The cosmic creation story is the way in which the universe is inaugurating the next era of its ongoing journey. I'm curious what you guys think about this reading, because what's fascinating to me is the way it's largely harmonious with the view of the evolution of the cosmos and all of the natural sciences. Everything physics tells us, everything chemistry tells us, everything biology tells us, but it's not cold and lifeless and disenchanted. Excuse me. It's alive. It has this religious, spiritual quality to it in telling it as a story, as an unfolding drama that takes 15 billion years to unfold. And I wonder why we don't tell that story more. So I feel like, the astronomers and cosmologists that I know, they do have some sort of storytelling approach to how they tell the story of the unfolding nature of the cosmos. But then they strip out all the values and the meaning and the cultural significance of it to focus sort of narrowly on the science rather than on the way we can find meaning and value and significance and our place in the cosmos by telling a story, just like people told cosmic stories around the campfires. So I guess this is yet another way to reconcile, the science, the natural sciences, the naturalistic view of the world with some sort of religious or spiritual view. So I think in the course of the class, you've seen at least a couple ways we can go. We could treat this as two different worldviews that need to be reconciled, the religious view and the scientific worldview, maybe modifying each worldview accordingly to make them fit harmoniously together. we can look at this from the perspective of science, trying to use science itself to figure out how to make these religious concepts like revelation or miracles or prayer or incarnation harmonious with the natural science, and see what the sciences themselves tell us about the way the natural world functions, and what room there is for those kinds of qualities, those kinds of events to occur, given the way the natural world functions. But here, Brian Swimme is taking a slightly different approach. He's basically saying what we've forgotten to do as we've learned more and more and more about the natural world. We've disenchanted it. We've stripped out all of the meaning and all the values and all the significance, all the dramatic elements, all the things that we need as humans to ground our lives, to tell us our place in the cosmos, to tell us who we are and what we should believe and what values we should have. And he's saying that if we start telling this, not just telling a religious story, it's not like reverting to a pre-scientific era. If we tell the scientific story of the creation of the universe, the unfolding evolution of the cosmos, the evolution of Earth geologically, the evolution of life on our planet through evolutionary biology, the evolution of humans and culture and values and spirituality and religions, all of those things taken, in a very grandiose sense, a 15 billion year old drama. If we tell it as a story, not just as a cold, passive, disheartened science, but if we tell the scientific story as a story, you can be harmonious with science. You can accept all the things that science would tell us about how the universe functions and its origin and how it's unfolded and how we got here and how life has emerged and evolved. But if we tell it as a story, that story can be laden with meaning and values and significance and all of the things that seem to be lost in this disenchanted, modern, contemporary scientific worldview. It's a really fascinating approach because it's not rejecting science at all. It's embracing science and then doing something else with it to give us an injection of meaning that he thinks was stripped out in the course of the natural sciences, viewed from a reductionistic, materialistic, mechanistic, physicalist standpoint. And if science itself is rejecting those qualities, as we've seen in some of the natural sciences through things like systems biology and top-down causation, then there's lots of room to tell that story, the story of the unfolding emergence of the cosmos and our place in it today, and all the future evolution to come, the billions of years yet to come. I think we forget that sometimes. We forget that, yes, the universe has been here for 15 billion years, and all of it has culminated in us. We usually forget that there's more to come, right? We treat ourselves as the culmination of the evolution of the cosmos. This is what he's saying at the beginning of the article. He's saying we've put ourselves on the pinnacle of creation. Religion has done this by calling ourselves the pinnacle of creation. We're the ones made in God's image, right? So we kind of put ourselves on a pedestal. But we forget that we're just a snapshot and that there's billions of years of evolution yet to come. All the creativity, all the novelty, all the emergence, all the discoveries, all the inventions, all the creativity and artistic creativity, all the things yet to come in the short term and in the long cosmic term. We're not the culmination of that. We're just a moment in history, right? And if we take that long-term viewpoint, viewing ourselves as the culmination, yes, of all previous history, but we're the starting point of all future evolution, all future cosmic unfolding, all future cosmic emergence. That's a radically different way to look at our place in the cosmos than the culmination of all of creation with ourselves on a pedestal. And in knocking ourselves down a peg, I think we find that we can actually re-inject some meaning into our place in the cosmos by recognizing that we have a place not just here in the human sphere, not just as the culmination of life on Earth, but as a significant but still kind of limited place in the cosmos. We have this place in cosmic history, and that knocks us off our pedestal while filling our lives with potential meaning in terms of what we should be doing, how we steer future evolution and how we steer future creation, how we steer the unfolding of the cosmos and our place in all of that. It has this epic quality, like reading Homer, like reading the Iliad or reading the Odyssey, like Odysseus's, home 20-year journey home from Troy, all the drama and the events and the struggle and the strife and overcoming obstacles. All of that has a grandeur to it that we forget to tell when we're talking about the cosmic story, even from the perspective of modern physics and modern biology and modern cosmology. So it's a fascinating way to look at the cosmos. I thought that was exciting and interesting when I first encountered it as an undergraduate. Here I am, 20 years later, passing it on to you as something that you can take away. Do with it as you will. If you have a religious view, I think the challenge would be to try to reconcile that view with all the things about the natural world you believe as a result of the scientific worldview we live in. If you've rejected a religious worldview, maybe prematurely, try to think about what were the things in that religious worldview that you want to preserve, and how can you reconcile, again, that with the natural world and the things we learn from the natural sciences. That's an interesting project if you care about the harmoniousness of your worldview. But if you find that the world that we learn about through the natural sciences, through physics or chemistry or biology, or even the social sciences, is disenchanted and cold and distant and meaningless and valueless, try telling that story in slightly grander terms, starting with the evolution of the origin of the cosmos, with the ongoing evolution and unfolding of the cosmos, the evolution of life, the evolution of all the things we consider human, but also look to the future. What does this mean for what we create and what the future path of humanity is, the future path of the entire cosmos, either narrowly for us humans, or in terms of the overall biology of the planet, or cosmologically in terms of the overall evolution of the cosmos. I think if you think in those more grand terms while telling the story of modern science, you can find that a lot more meaning of life and meaning of the cosmos than is commonly given credit for by the natural sciences. So again, this would be sort of a postmodern way of looking at the relationship between science and religion, not viewing science as cold and disenchanted, not viewing religion as conflicting with the natural sciences in the way that the creation evolution debate commonly characterizes it to be, but viewing the two together constructively, harmoniously, but not stripping out things like value and meaning and purpose, and not glossing over the substantive differences that genuinely need to be reconciled between a religious worldview and a worldview that's informed by the natural sciences. I think that's a huge intellectual project that's just beginning. It's very easy to just reject religion and go full on with science, but I think you'll see that even science itself has some of these religious or spiritual or value-laden properties that scientists don't like to pay attention to. But when you pay attention to them, you get a lot more harmony between a religious worldview and a scientific worldview than just putting them in separate categories like that. So that's all I have for you guys. If you have any questions for me, now is an excellent time where you can shoot me an email and ask me any questions. But most importantly, remember that your final paper and your extra credit paper and any work at all, if you need to catch up on any mind map assignments, if you want to respond to any of the attendance questions between spring break and now, go ahead and do that in Blackboard as well. But everything needs to be to me through Blackboard by the end of the day on Thursday, say Thursday at midnight. So I have time to calculate all the grades and get your grades submitted. If you submit anything to me on Friday or later, you run the risk of my just not having time to get to it and it not being considered. So
I have a quick question.
Sure, absolutely.
So where our grades are, I'm pretty sure I've done all my mind maps up until now. There's a few like number ones, like I think 12 is missing. So I'm not sure, because I don't see any zeros, so I'm not sure if you're showing the work that we didn't do.
Yeah, so I haven't graded some of the recent ones, and for the mind maps, I'm not really grading them. I'm giving you credit for them if you've done them. So yeah. I've got a list of ones I just need to go in and give credit for. So if you're talking about the most recent 2 or 3, that's what's going on there.
Okay.
So don't worry about that. Same thing with the attendance questions. I just need to manually go in and give credit for those, and I'm just going to do those. I'm going to, there are a few that people submitted late. I need to circle back and give credit for those, and then the last 2 or 3 I just haven't added into the grade book yet. So
okay,
it's not gone. It's points are all there. I just need to add them into the grade book. So
okay.
If you've worried you missed any, then let me know in particular. But if you've submitted and the grade just hasn't shown up in the grade book yet, that's just a matter of me getting it into the grade book. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Any questions on the final papers or the extra credit papers before we call it a day? Okay, if there's nothing else, I'll see you guys for our last class on Thursday. Please try to be here. I have an interesting class session for you on Thursday. Hopefully as interesting as today, I think maybe even more interesting. What I want to do next time, I want to give you guys a little bit of practical advice from me. I think I feel like I do a disservice if I don't give some practical life advice, in a philosophy class. We spend so much time focusing on abstract philosophical concepts. Next time you're going to get kind of the world according to Zach and my advice for getting through the world, given everything we talked about about in class and given some influences in my life from other sources. And I put it all together into something that I think will be fun and interesting. So no mind map or anything for next time. Just focus on your papers and getting the rest of the work turned in that you need to get caught up on. But do try to be here on Thursday because it'll be a fun class, and I'll try to wrap up the entire semester and we'll have a good time doing it.
Sweet.
Great. Have a good couple days.
Have a
I'll see you
good
guys on
one.
Thursday.
Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you
Everyone.
so much.